So as human beings, we like to look at our situations as the pros and cons, the ups and the downs, or the good and bad of things. And so what I'm talking about today is a social exchange theory. And this theory, little do we know, it applies to our lives and it affects us actions that we take today. And having research on this theory, I have multiple sources to tell you all what this theory is and how it incorporates into our lives and will continue to incorporate into our lives. And learning about the social exchange theory will help us to better understand how we develop relationships with other people. So first, I will talk about what the social exchange theory is, who the theorist is, and how we can apply it to real-world situations. So first of all, what is the social exchange theory? So according to the Handbook of Social Psychology written by Karen S. Cook and other authors published in 2013, she explains what the social exchange theory is. The first social exchange theorist to come up with the theory is George Homans, and he was an American sociologist from the 20th century who mainly focused on interpersonal exchanges. And what that means is the interaction between individuals. And according to Cook, Homans believed that the social exchange was an exchange of activity between at least two parties, which was either more or less rewarding or costly. And so according to Homans, the cost consisted of alternatives. And to help better understand what the theory is, I will provide an example of how we can apply this theory. So for example, let's imagine a girl named Victoria and a boy named Stephen are in a relationship. It can either be a friendship or a romantic relationship. It doesn't really matter. But for example, Victoria looks at her relationship and she looks at the benefits and then she looks at the costs. So if the benefits outweigh the costs, she will remain in the relationship. And if the costs outweigh the benefits, she will leave the relationship. This is an example of how the social exchange theory can be applied. And so what George Homans is saying is that the social exchange theory is how we develop relationships based on a benefit to cost system. Now that I've talked about what the theory is and given you all an example of what how we can see the theory, let's apply it to a real world. So I'm not too sure if you have heard about what's going on in the Ukraine, and if you haven't, I will briefly talk about what is going on in the Ukraine. So as of late February 2014, the Ukrainian parliament impeaches their president because of a revolution that's going on in the Ukraine. And this creates a rocky term for the US and Russia, because what is happening is Russia assumes that the US and the EU, which is the European Union, directed and funded this revolution that's happening in the Ukraine. So Russia moves its forces into Crimea, and because of that, Crimea is now declared a territory temporarily occupied by Russia. And so in a recent article, posted on April 28, 2014, on the LA Times, written by Carol J. Williams, she says that Americans are supporting imposing tougher sanctions on Russia for its aggressiveness. And according to statistics of the polls, 62% of the polls said that they were opposed to offering support of any military aid, compared to the other 30%, which were in support of military aid. So how do we see the social exchange theory being applied in this real-world situation? Well, it is still on a benefit to cost system. And diplomacy is important in the world, and it creates relationships between the different countries and different nations based on cost and benefit. And how we see this is in the article that I talked about earlier. Most of the polled Americans say that they're not supporting military aid, and this is probably because of the costs of how Americans are reminded of the costs of war in the recent Afghanistan and Iraq, in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it also touches upon other aspects of life, such as relationship. And in an article posted in the Communication Studies Scholarly Journal, posted in 2006 by someone named Susan M. Woolymith and other theorists, they studied how we can use the social exchange theory in initiating romantic relationships. So how do we initiate romantic relationships? First, we according to Wildermuth, she says that the behaviors that we engage in to initiate a romantic relationship, if the benefits are perceived to outweigh the costs, that particular behavior is engaged in. And something that plays a huge part in initiating romantic relationships is our self-esteem, our evaluation of ourselves. So in her studies, some percentages of different behaviors of engagement in romantic relationships were proposed, and some ways were through humility and through sharing common experiences. And this is how we initiate romantic relationships, because we come up with different ways to initiate, but we choose one that we see as most beneficial. So that's one way how we see the social exchange theory being applied into politics, personal relationships, romantic relationships, and we can also see it in businesses as well. So now that I've talked about how this theory applies, let's wrap things up. It's important to talk about the social exchange theory because it helps us to better understand how we develop relationships with other people. And first I talk about what the theory is, who the theorist is, then I talk about how this theory applies into real-world situations. So the next time we break ties with someone, maybe we'll think either one of two things. Maybe we'll think, it's not so bad, it's not worth it to lose this person. Or maybe we'll think, I'm better off with